Good day, students. Today we would be discussing about sources of history or historical sources, a general introduction. In this lecture, we would be looking at the distinction of what constitutes a historical source, what are the varieties of historical sources that are available to the historian, and also we would be looking at the distinction between literary and archaeological sources. However, there is a further distinction which is usually made by historians regarding primary and secondary sources of information. So we would be looking at all of these in the lecture that we are going to have. As we all know, history is a discipline which deals with the past. And this exclusiveness about the past in the light of the present is something that the historian has to contend with. Historical sources, therefore, are almost an indispensable element of the wherewithal that a historian uses in order to do his disciplinary work and to make history as an interesting subject. Therefore, historical sources are the constituent elements which are required for a historian in order to make the craft of the historian workable. Historical sources are usually defined as a type of subject which needs to be categorized on the basis of where they are found, how they are found, and in the way in which the historian uses them. Historical sources, therefore, can be considered as almost like a brick. As a brick is used in a building, as cells constitute the human body, therefore the historical sources are almost the constituent elements of the building, which is the superstructure of history. Therefore, we can consider that historical sources need to be understood, analyzed, and utilized by a historian in order to make and work with his subject. As we all know, historical sources and the historians dealing with such sources are almost like a subject of contention among scholars. What constitutes a particular type of source is something which is decided by the historian before he begins to work with them. In order to understand how sources are used and how the historian uses these sources, one has to understand that historical sources have to be utilized in a proper format by the historian. The idea that history needs certain kinds of materials, and these materials have to be utilized in a certain fashion, is a basic presumption which the discipline of history assumes for itself. Therefore, if we move on, then we can find that there are three basic functions that a historian needs to fulfill. He needs to gather the historical data or the facts which are required for his analysis. Secondly, he must criticize and critically evaluate the data with the historical methods that are available to him. And thirdly, he must present the material which is gathered by him in a presentable, readable format and understandable by the reader. So if the historian needs to fulfill these three functions, then we find that historical sources are the most important and the significant element that is required for him or her to work with. As we all know, historical sources require sifting, finding, locating, and also corroborating. What I mean by that is that historical sources can be found in certain places which are perhaps not even known to the historian when he begins. But at the same time, he must also identify the requirements that his subject entails. For instance, if an ancient historian of India was to work on the Mauryan state or the Mauryan age, then he would have to identify first what are the constitutive elements of the times, of the age that he is going to speak on. And therefore, identification of sources, the presentation of sources, and the authentication of the historical data that is presented within those texts needs to be understood by the historian. Therefore, historical source is usually defined as an original source that contains important historical information. And these are like the clues for a historian to work with. While the historian principally relies on written sources, on documents of different categories, he also depends on a variety of other sources. For example, he may look at buildings, the architecture of those buildings, different kinds of sites which are archaeological in nature. He can also identify the tools which were used by people in those bygone days in order to go ahead and move ahead with his sources. Therefore, sources can be of a variety of natures. In fact, we find that usually there are two basic types of sources which are identified. One is the material remains or the archaeological sources, that is one. And the second is literary sources, which are written documents of different categories. These are the two basic divisions which are made. There are also other categories which may be included within this domain. For example, oral sources and ballads and different kinds of data which are in the oral format are also considered today as a very important element of history. If we move on to the literary sources, then we find that literary sources consider a variety of natures. In fact, there is no comprehensive historical chronicle which was written about India in the same fashion as we have in, say, for example, in Roman Empire or in the Greek civilization. However, despite the fact that we do not have a very comprehensive historical chronicle in ancient India, there were varieties of kinds of historical data and literary historical records which are there in the ancient times. In the early ancient times, we find that the first documents that we receive from the times are the Vedas. The literary records which consider the religious, the social, as well as in a certain format the political affairs of those times are the Vedas, which are four in nature: the Rig Veda, the Sama Veda, the Yajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda. And we also have, as we move ahead in time, different kinds of other semi-historical and religious data. For example, the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, and the Upanishads. And these kinds of data are at the same time social, religious, and political in nature. So, in the case of India, we have literary records of this category at the beginning of Indian civilization. If we move ahead in time, then we find that around the first millennium BC, we also have the epics. The epics are namely the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And historical data is located even within these texts as a particular variety which has been used by ancient historians. We find that if we move down into time, from the 6th century BC onward, we find that the Puranic literature gives a lot of genealogical lists about kings who ruled during these eras. And these genealogical lists of kings, although they are exaggerated in a certain measure, they are also considered to be of historical value. And these historical data have been used in consultation with other kinds of sources, literary and otherwise, to gather a certain degree of certainty. If we move ahead in time, then we find that the Buddhist and the Jaina literature of the 4th, 5th century BC are also relevant for understanding the religious history of the times. And we find that all of these which we have just talked about constitute a type of religio-historical literature with certain elements of myth attached to it. However, when we move ahead into the first millennium AD, then we find a certain category of literary sources which are more biographical in nature. For example, we find that certain court historians began to write different kinds of biographical literature for their patrons, and such examples are numerous. Banabhatta's Harshacharita is one of them, and we also have different other kinds of literature which are based and located around certain categories of dynasties and kings. For instance, we have Bakpati and Bilhana's two epics on Yashovarman and Vikramaditya of the later Chalukya dynasty, and these were the Gauravaho and the Vikramanka Deva Charita. Other evidences also include the Ramacharita about the Bengali king Ramapala in the 7th and 8th century. So biographical literature is one which constitutes a certain genre within literary sources. But there are also regional and local historical chronicles which are of immense importance for understanding history. And historical sources are dependent on regional and local chronicles. Such kinds of local and regional chronicles are there in the ancient Indian history for various parts of India. For example, in the case of Kashmir, we have Kalhana's Rajatarangini, which was written in the mid-12th century, and we also have a number of historical sources for Gujarat, whereby we find the Rasamala, the Kirti Kaumudi of Someshwara, the Shukrita Samkirtana of Arisimha, and there are others also which fall into these categories. There are also regional chronicles of Sindh. For example, the Chachnama is an important source which gives us information about the 8th, 9th, and the 10th century in Sindh. These historical chronicles of certain regions constitute one of the important sources of history which are there within literary sources. There was also a very lively tradition of foreign travelers' accounts, which fall within the category of literary sources. And as we know, India, due to its prosperity, due to its economic growth in the ancient period downwards, enabled different kinds of travelers to come. And there was a large involvement of foreign travelers in the Indian subcontinent. Starting from the days of Pliny and Ptolemy, we find an anonymous source, which is the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea in the 1st century AD, which gives us a wealth of information about the trading ports of the time, the different kinds of products which used to be traded, and also the sea routes which were taken by different historians. The Chinese travelers, Fa Hien, Huensang, Yitsing, and Ma Huan, present us an immense wealth of detail regarding the 4th, 5th, and later centuries. And the religious, social, and economic aspects of Indian history can be gleaned from these sources. We also have in the medieval period a number of foreign travelers coming to India. From Al-Biruni, who wrote his Tahqiq-i-Hind in the 11th century, down till Ibn Battuta in the mid-14th century, and also later on Bernier and Tavernier and Peter Mundy in the Mughal period. They also give us their own views about Indian civilization and culture through an eyewitness account. Literary sources which are gleaned from such foreign travelers' accounts are very important as a category within literary sources. But there are also another genre, which is the literary and grammatical works, which also include the plays which were written by playwrights of India. For example, Kalidasa's Abhigyana Shakuntalam and Malavikagnimitram were important not just for the history and society of the times, but also for understanding the way in which the culture of theatre, of public performances used to gather and used to be used by the historians of those times. So Vishakadatta's Mudra Rakshasa and Devi Chandraguptam are also important sources of history writing. We also have another category which is called autobiographical genre. The autobiographical genre, which were written usually by literate sultans of the time, for example, the Fatuhati Firuz Shahi, which was written by Firuz Shah Tughlaq in the 14th century, and later on, with the coming in of the Mughals, we find the Babar-Nama, and later on, the Tuzuk-e-Babari, and later on in the 17th century, the Tuzuk-e-Jahangiri was written by the emperors themselves, who were educated enough to give their own viewpoint through their autobiographies. In the context of the times, we find that the late medieval and the early modern period also found vent through the use of different kinds of literary sources which were written down, not just in the manuscript format, but also on paper and printed in the 18th century onwards. The coming in of print obviously led to a revolution within the production of different kinds of literary genres. And this initiated a number of documentations which was used by the states as well as the people of those times. For example, we find that the colonial state tried to write its own approach through governmental reports, through findings, through various types of gazetteers, and various other kinds of written data which have not been found for the earlier times. So printing obviously created a new avenue for the literary sources to gather steam. But this is not to mention that the Mughal state or the state prior to it, that is the Delhi Sultanate, they also had their own types of literary sources like farmans, different kinds of poetical genres, different kinds of other versical and prose writings which were written on paper. So, as we can understand, the literary genre is of immense variety. Coming to the modern era, we also find diaries, memoirs, different kinds of other literary sources which were written by individuals as well as by important personages of the time. And these constitute an invaluable resource for any historian who wants to study the age. If we move on to the archaeological sources, we find that archaeology as a word is of Greek origin. Archaeos means ancient, and we find that the archaeological discipline is one which constitutes an important source material for all kinds of historical data. Archaeological sources can be identified as those which have been used by people of those times. The daily tools which were used by them, the need for different kinds of pots, the pottery of the times, and also the different kinds of other weapons and tools which were used by them all fall within the category of archaeological data. And these have been used by historians to reconstruct the history of the times. We find that archaeological site is a specific term which is used by historians and archaeologists to identify certain areas where these sources abound. For example, the Neolithic and the Paleolithic sites at Bagor in Rajasthan, at Bhimbetka in Madhya Pradesh, in Burzahom in Kashmir, and many other such sites are important where information about the past can be identified. We find that these archaeological finds are located, they are observed, they are recorded, and they are also interpreted by archaeologists in order to give us data of those times. The Archaeological Survey of India, which was established in 1861 under Alexander Cunningham, played a major role in surveying of these sites. And even today, the Archaeological Survey of India is doing a stellar work in identifying and gathering data from the ancient historical times onward. Up to 1920, as we know, the Indian civilization was considered to begin only with the Aryans. But from 1920 onwards, with the identification of the Harappan civilization, and later on with the finding of new sites of Harappan origin in various parts, for instance at Rakhigari, at Dholavira, at Kalibangan, and at Lothal, we find that the data and the type of sites which existed in the Harappan civilization have been identified. In the south of India, for example, Arikamedu in Tamil Nadu is one such site where Indo-Roman coins, Indo-Roman trading port, and Indo-Roman products have been found in large quantities. Archaeological monuments are one category of sources which are very important within that genre. In fact, we find that the different kinds of sculpture and monuments which are there in India, for example, temples, and different kinds of architectural traditions which have evolved, the Dravidiya tradition, the Nagara tradition, and the Vesara tradition, are important for our understanding of Indian history and sculpture and architecture. We also find that the Kailashnath temple and the Rathas at Mahabalipuram are certain important sites from where the monumental heritage of India can be located. The Pallava, the Hoysala, the Chol, and the Vijayanagara dynasties of India were important patronizing dynasties which established a large number of such temples and monuments. And all of this is an heritage which is used by historians for their understanding of the past. If we move on to the medieval period, we find that new types of architecture came in, new type of monuments came in. And we find that mosques, various kinds of minars, various kinds of forts were also established, like Shah Jahanabad as a city which was built by Shah Jahan in the 17th century, is of immense significance in order to understand the morphology of an urban center. And we find that such kinds of studies are required as historical sources for any historian who wants to work with the Mughal age. Types of archaeology are varied and various. We find that some archaeologists study human remains, and these are known as bioarchaeology. We also have zooarchaeology, which is archaeological remains of different kinds of animals. We have paleoethnobotany, which is about ancient plant remains. What did our ancestors used to eat? The kinds of seeds which are available. All of this falls within the category of paleoethnobotany. Environmental archaeology or paleoecology is also an important sub-branch of archaeology which helps us to understand how environmental conditions changed over time. Underwater or marine archaeology is also one such important segment which has developed in recent times. The technological improvements like C14 dating is important for us to identify the date of a certain find within a certain civilization. So therefore, archaeology is one important subsegment of historical resources. We also have epigraphy, which means that different types of inscriptions which existed during the times. We find that Ashokan edicts, which are scattered throughout India, is one such important segment which falls within the category of epigraphy. And inscriptional data from the later times. For example, we find that a large number of inscriptional evidences exist, both in Sanskrit as well as in Prakrit in various parts of India. And also from the 8th, 9th century onwards, we have a large number of materials inscriptional which were inscribed on stone or on copper plate, which were used in different kinds of regional languages. And therefore, inscriptional evidence also is an important subsegment which is there for the historian to study the past. We find that there is also an important element which we learn from such inscriptional evidences. We find that inscriptions, because they cannot be changed, because the script which was written on them is unchangeable, these give us authentic information about the past. And this is important because corroboration of history is required. Literary sources need to be corroborated with other kinds of data which are existent in archaeology. Numismatics is also one such subsegment which deals with the study of coins, different kinds of coins which were minted from the time of the Greco-Roman and the Bactrian Greeks who settled in the northwestern parts of India. And later on, as we move on in time, the Gupta emperors, and later on, even during the Delhi Sultanate, we find a large number of numismatic evidences which exist. And they give us a wealth of information about the kings who ruled, the dates in which they ruled, and also the finds, the location from where coins have been found, are important for identifying the territorial extent of the empire of a certain king. Therefore, inscriptions and coins fall within the category of archaeological sources. Now we move on to the important segment, which is the identification of primary and secondary data. We must understand that both literary as well as archaeological remains are certain aspects which belong to that particular period. And this periodization, this contemporariness of a source is important in order to constitute it as a primary source. So primary source is a first-hand testimony, which is important. Secondary sources, on the other hand, are those sources which are identified after reading of primary sources. So these involve generalizations, analysis, as well as interpretation and evaluation of the original information which was contained within the primary sources. So this distinction between primary and secondary needs to be kept in mind for a modern historian before he begins to work. We must also understand that primary and secondary sources are somewhat hazy in certain aspects. We find that, for example, Megasthenes' Indica has not been found, but this particular work has been referred to in various other literary sources. If at a certain point of time in the future this particular document is found, then obviously it would become a major element of primary source. Primary sources are important also for understanding the value of a certain source for the times. The perspective which is written within a primary source gives us direct evidence, first-hand evidence of the time, while secondary evidences or secondary sources are built upon primary sources. So this distinction also needs to be kept in mind by us. So as we have discussed, we must understand that sources can be of various types, and these sources have been evolving along with the evolution of the discipline of history. History as a discipline is today at a verge where new categories of evidences, new types of sources are also coming in within the ambit of historical sources. For instance, we find oral sources have become one of the most important elements today of understanding popular mentality, popular consciousness. Therefore, rumors and different kinds of ballads and and popular sayings, these are also within the category of historical sources today. Therefore, we must understand that the rise of interdisciplinarity between different disciplines, the multidisciplinary nature of history today, whereby ethnography, anthropology, and other kinds of subjects which are being dealt with by the historian in a very concerted manner, has led to a variety of historical sources being used for the purposes of history writing. And this preview will understandably give you an idea of what basic conditions were required for the historian to work with his methods. So sources of history are an important segment which needs to be identified before moving on to research methodology as a discipline. Thank you so much.